What's the worst coworker you've ever worked with? Story 1. I worked at Starbucks for a year, one of the very worst years of my life, and while I was there, I had a coworker named Eric. I was at the till that the day Eric came in with his resume, and there was under his name he had typed Architect of Imagination. Eric was an aspiring writer, but he had trouble stringing a sentence together. He couldn't be on the machine because he couldn't remember how to use it, or how any single drink was made. He couldn't be a support role because he had no way of predicting or understanding what anyone else on the floor needed or even was saying. He couldn't be on the register because he couldn't mark a cup, and even our most patient customers would inevitably raise their voices at his incompetence. Reliably, he would genuinely look like he was about to cry. I was so torn between rage and pity. He made a terrible job so much harder, but he was just so breathtakingly, pitifully, shockingly dumb. I have never met anyone like him before or since. One night I was thinking about something particularly vicious I had to say in response to something particularly baffling Eric had done, and found myself wondering about his life outside of our store. Was the world scary and confusing to Eric? Did it seem like life was just happening to him? I imagine him standing in traffic looking vaguely surprised and confused, forgetting how he'd gotten there. I looked him up on Facebook and was pretty disturbed by what I found. Eric didn't look awkward or scared on Facebook. He looked stylish, suave. He had product in his hair. Beautiful women in expensive-looking clothes smiled in his photos. Several posted on his wall expressing what a good time they'd had with him recently, often citing a writing sesh. It felt like I was on a different plane. It felt like I was having a stroke. So, when my question became, who is Eric and who is scamming who? The popular theory in the store was that Eric was essentially a method actor doing research for a book or script. I came close to asking him about it a few times, but I was so afraid that I was wrong. I imagined myself over and over asking, are you a method actor? Or are you really and truly this stupid? It just wasn't something I could bring myself to risk. I wonder about him all the time, actually, and who he might be terrorizing today. Another theory could be that he just really didn't need the money, and it's just acting this way to troll everyone and amuse himself. Some people are just bizarre with their behavior and often just like being the center of attention, regardless of whether it is positive or negative. On the other hand, some people just have zero work skills in their life. I don't know why or how this happens, but people just suck at manual labor sometimes. Story 2. A little bit of context, I work in a hospital as an nurse's aide, and my department focuses on transporting patients around the facility for tests and room changes. I work the night shift, and this person started their shift at 6 a.m. There was this lady I worked with that just had the nastiest attitude. Normally I can get along with most folks, but this person just brought the whole room down with negative vibes. Nothing was ever good, and she always had bad shifts. One thing she did that upset a lot of people was take patients down for x-rays and leave them down there to return to our office. The big thing to remember here is that even the lengthiest x-rays take maybe 10 minutes at the very most, 2 to 5 minutes on average for the scans. Every morning we got x-rays to do, and I had to send her back down to return patients to their rooms after the x-ray technicians called right as she got back to their office. The instances of leaving patients were common, so I informed my boss several times in person and email. Apparently, she had an attitude with every other department we worked with and never informed nurses that we were moving their patients. It's a big no-no when meds and vital signs need to be done. One day, she had abandoned a patient in the ER waiting room when they were waiting for a ride home and told no one, so security had found a patient just sitting alone for like 15 to 30 minutes without supervision. It took this and a year of recorded evidence for this person to finally get fired. When that happened, it's like a dark cloud lifted, and a lot of people were relieved. Oh, and she tried to get various employees around the facility to sign a form to argue against her case. One person signed. Story 3. My worst coworker was one I worked with when I was a cashier at Walmart. She approached me and asked me to cash out her paycheck. I was still new at the job and never got training on how to do that function. She was sympathetic, so she walked me through how to do it. Transaction over and done, and I go about my day. I get called back a couple of days later by my managers, and they circled me in an office and accused me of stealing. After tears, videotapes, and telling them what happened, they told me that apparently this coworker of mine had stolen not only from me, but several other people that day as well. They just wanted to confirm I wasn't in on the deal. Story 4. Hired a cook on a good recommendation. He was just fine the first 2 weeks, and then I noticed food going missing. Then supplies started going missing. Then a customer told me that he had been adding auto 30% tips to his food purchases. When I looked at the books, I saw that he had been adding 30% tips to all the credit card sales. and the cash rings were off from what should have been sold. I fired him that day. The next day, he came in and apologized, said he was on stuff and was going to rehab, and I wished him well. And then next day, he tried to break in after closing and was caught. That would suck for a lot of those customers once they realize a 30% tip has been added to their transaction, but I also imagine that he could probably get away with some of that because how many people actually look closely at every single transaction on their credit card? So many of us probably just pay that balance every month and don't take the time to verify all the transactions. Story 5. This is about 15 years ago, but the office I worked in instituted a scent-free policy. One woman, who was already insufferable, was so offended by it that she snuck in her perfume collection. She'd walk down the halls and spray perfume into empty offices or cubicles when no one was looking or before everyone arrived in the morning. This went on for well over a month or two, and we had no idea who was responsible. My coworkers and I started referring to this mysterious person as the Chanel Bandit. She was finally caught on camera in the act, and she had left for 3 weeks vacation and was unaware that we had installed in cameras after a break-in. Some of us already suspected her, as the Chanel Bandit mysteriously stopped spraying while she was away. She quit right after she was caught. None of us were sad to see that cedar-scented psycho leave. Story 6. I worked with a guy who couldn't learn new skills. When he started, he had to learn new programs and processes just like anyone would at almost any job. He wouldn't pick up on it, whether it was where to click in a software to get a certain result or how to fill out a report. Everyone on my team took turns showing him the ropes, and it never sunk in. I remember being so frustrated because he could not figure out how to minimize a window. Top right corner, click on the straight line. It takes like 3 to 4 seconds for him to drag the mouse to the corner, and then he'd hover around it but never on it. Super nice guy, but impossible to work and collaborate with on projects because so much time was wasted. Story 7. I worked with someone in retail. He was my boss, and not a particularly bad guy, but he was a control freak who had to interject his opinion during every conversation anyone was having with a customer. This also went as far as him being in the middle of helping someone himself, stopping helping that customer, to lean over to my till to help me with my transaction even though there was no indication I needed help, and had worked there for over 5 years. This help would be in the form of him telling me what button to hit next on the till, to telling a customer they were wrong to have any given opinion on a topic, also to telling customers that their choice of entertainment they were purchasing wasn't what they were really after, even though they specifically came into the store for that specific item. Yeah, sounds like a cut and dry case of narcissism and arrogance to me. It seems like this boss was someone who wanted to have the appearance of the boss and be in charge at all times, but they can't stand not being seen as the expert in all things, probably due to some serious insecurities. I remember working with a guy who was very similar, and it just drove the whole team crazy. The solution was to make up some inconsequential duties and missions for him so that he felt important, even without having any real importance. Story 8. I worked in a certain touring exhibition last summer. It's not Potter, FYI. And 200 people who were applying for jobs, 20 of us got the job. We were all close-knit and had a love for the exhibit content, and being all genuinely interesting people made us a family. But one woman, she thought that she was the world's biggest star for having a 3-second cameo on Game of Thrones, and sent harassing messages and calls to many of us. She harassed a lovely guy on the shop team who had no interest, undermined the bosses constantly, talked back, and was rude to customers. When she thought we talked about her behind her back, she got defensive and spiteful. We didn't. And one day she got knocked back for good by the shop guy and for some reason decided to take it out on me. Started slabbering about me around to every other coworker but never to my face. She called me a white snake. Now, I am albino and my hair color got me seriously bullied in school along the vein of her insults, so her name calling was very hurtful. I had enough and I took it to HR, and she was fired for her actions. I could go on, but she doesn't deserve any more thought. Story 9. His name was Dan, and Dan was 37 working at a dead-end job as a lab specimen processor in a windowless room for 9 hours a day. He ate only Burger King, but without the lettuce because, quote, that's rabbit food. He drank literally a gallon of Mountain Dew a day and was confused as to why people were horrified by that. There's water in it, he would say. Apparently, if he ate corn, he would vomit and would have to go to the hospital. He would tell me he firmly believed that man and dinosaur roamed the earth at the same time, along with many other theories that came from his gut. One day, we got into a political argument before the 2016 election where he said, "If Bernie Sanders is elected president, there will be a civil war, and I will not hesitate to kill you and your family." Yeah, so Dan was fired. I got out of there as soon as I could, too. Don't be like Dan. Story 10. My current supervisor and head supervisor. We work in the MRDD field. I got a call one Tuesday morning and my boss was slurring her words and telling me to bring her hangover food. I show up about 20 minutes later before my scheduled shift, and when I walk in, she could not stand up straight, and all you could smell was alcohol. Our head supervisor leaves, and she fully confesses that she was absolutely trashed and that she had been drinking from 9 p.m. Monday night to Tuesday at 12 p.m. with our head supervisor on the clock. She then proceeded to sleep and leave me to care for 4 individuals for 8 hours while she was still on the clock. That following Thursday, I show up to work again, and she got on my face, and again, it smelled like a bar. She told me that if I told anyone, I would lose my job and licenses. That weekend, she tried to force me to work a 3 p.m. to 4 a.m. shift because someone had a fever and couldn't come in. When I told her I was not required to cover anything outside of my shift without prior consent, she screamed again in my face and told me to just leave. I called my head supervisor, and I haven't heard anything still. 2 weeks later, I ended up breaking my foot on my weekend off, and I called her from the hospital Sunday afternoon, telling her that I have to have the next 48 hours off to somewhat start the healing process. And she refused that and put me on light duty. So I show up Monday afternoon, 26 hours after I got the proper medical care for my foot, and said something about my foot hurting, and she told me, "Well, a chunky girl of your size can't carry your own weight." Now, I'm not small, but I'm not happy where I am, and my weight has nothing to do with the fact that I broke a bone less than 48 hours ago, and only 24 hours with medical care, and then she proceeded to leave me alone with a seizure patient who put herself on the floor, and I had to pick her up. She came back around 9:30 p.m. to put them into bed, and then she was drinking again. Story 11. For a few summers in high school and college, I worked as a groundskeeper at a large hotel complex. As a seasonal employee, I was paired up with the year-round full-time groundskeeper during my shifts, and then he and I would work alternate weekends. He retired suddenly when I was at school, so by the time I returned for the summer, they had hired a replacement. Ed was a lateral hire, having previously worked in the hotel's kitchens. He was in his 50s, but based on his maturity and intelligence, he wasn't more than a teenager. I heard some rumblings about him being a little off, but didn't pay them much mind since I knew I'd be spending the whole summer with this guy, and didn't want to go into our relationship with any preconceived notions about him. The first thing I discovered was that he was dumber than a box of rocks. He used words he didn't know the meaning of, so of course, they didn't make much sense the way that he used them. Whenever the subject of music would come up, he would never fail to mention that he didn't like that rap crap. 15 years later, and I can still hear him saying that phrase. He laughed at the dumbest little things. He put an ice cube on my seat in our golf cart, which we used to get around the property, and I'd sit on it, noticed it instantly, and stand up and brush the seat off. Wouldn't even get my pants wet. But he'd laugh at it as if it was the prank of the century. Our golf carts had roofs on them, and it only takes one time to bang your head on it in order to avoid doing it again. But not for Ed. The first time he hit his head was a doozy. He had to stand there crouched over for a few minutes to regain his composure. He whacked it so hard, and I felt really bad for him. A few days later, he did it again, and I was again concerned. But it became a weekly occurrence. My reactions went from concerned to confused, like, how does this guy keep doing this, to amused. By the end of the summer, I would lose my crap laughing whenever he hit his head. There was no other way to react than to laugh. If this guy didn't learn the first dozen times he hit his head, then there was no hope for him. One time, Ed was helping the boss move an extension ladder. He lifted it up and put it on the roof of a golf cart. The ladder was longer than the cart, so it stuck out both the front and the back sides of the cart. No sooner did he place his end on the roof, he turned away, then turned back, and walked face first into the ladder exactly where he just put it. My boss asked me if he was okay, and then as his mind processed what had just happened, he asked Ed how he ran into the ladder he just put there. His immaturity was the next thing I noticed. Like kid jokes and comments at a frequency that made me think I was back in middle school. One day, he had these iron stakes in the back of the cart, and we were driving around and Ed grabbed one of the stakes and let it drag on the ground. Like you would a stick on a fence as you walk by to make noise, making a scraping noise on the asphalt. It was annoying AF. I asked him to stop, so he lifted it up, waited 10 seconds, and then started dragging it again. I asked him again to stop, which he did again and restarted shortly after. That particular day, I wasn't in the mood for his crap, so I just stopped the cart in the middle of the street, took the key, and walked away. He ran after me and begged me to come back and that he wouldn't do it again. Fortunately, he didn't. My coworkers told me stories about how he was on the days I wasn't there. More of the same, constantly tripping over stuff, falling down stairs, banging his head. They eventually started referring to him as Homer Simpson because he was such a doofus. I could feel myself getting dumber every day I spent with him. His childish antics drove me insane, and by the end of the summer, I had had enough. I decided to find a new job for the following year because I knew I couldn't spend another summer with him. Last I heard, Ed got injured by getting his arm stuck in the cardboard baler and couldn't work for several months. How he did that, I will never know, since you can't turn those things on unless the safety gate is closed, so it's not like it was running when it happened. He ultimately was never medically cleared to return to work, so I don't know what became of him. I was Facebook friends with him when I was in college, but got sick of all the Candy Crush and Farmville invitations from him, so that I just unfriended him. Why does it seem like this was some sort of TBI written all over it? And if that's true, it probably doesn't help that he is constantly running into things with his head on a regular basis. He seems like a walking liability to have in your employment too, because if he is that accident prone and you don't do anything to correct it and keep others safe, you're opening yourself up for a major issue or lawsuit. In the comments, does anyone have a story of that one coworker who just constantly was unsafe or reckless? Story 12. He just wouldn't work. Just wouldn't. This was in a research lab. He was visiting researchers from another country, and he spent a lot of time asking tons of non-work related questions, to the point of disrupting others' work. In the course of a year, he designed one very basic experiment and didn't actually do it, just designed it. He was above doing bench work, apparently. He picked fights with everyone doing any experiment related to the one that he was planning because he didn't want to have to share credit for anyone. He wouldn't clean up after himself, wouldn't pick up things from the floor, actually called me in from another room because he wouldn't take a stringless tea bag out of his mug. Also, on a different occasion, because he'd knocked some things off a hanger on the back of the door and for whatever reason wouldn't pick them up. It was kind of like working with a child. He must have had servants where he lived, and I don't know how, but he was there for his PhD. The boss fired him. He was one of 2 people in her 30-plus year career that she'd ever fired. Story 13. My receptionist is the most useless person I've ever met. Ignores the phones while playing on her own personal device, takes countless personal calls too, and also does all personal business on their work computer from shopping to bills. On any given day, we'll constantly find ways to avoid doing work by getting up and shooting the crap with anyone patient enough to listen. My personal favorite? Does not take an ounce of criticism whatsoever. Every question or suggestion is an attack or bullying in their opinion. This person has filed countless HR complaints because other employees have suggested that this person focus on their work. Countless meetings and times that has been wasted trying to appease this person. Story 14. 3-person department, myself, an awesome dude, and this terrible new coworker. She was fresh out of college and believed that she was smarter than myself and other team members because of that. She totally discounted anyone's opinion except her own and one manager that let her do whatever she wanted. She was the worst one-upper I'd ever met. Even for stupid things like going to a coffee stand, she'd chime in and say how her friends work at a coffee stand and that they know her order by heart. Just stupid stuff. She thought she was adorable and charming, but was incredibly grating and worthless. She constantly messed up on her job, but if you tried to help or give any constructive feedback, she'd cry and go to her wet nurse, aka the one manager that liked her. She almost lasted 4 years, which blew my mind. She was furloughed at the beginning of Corona, but will not be returning as her position is being taken by the owner's daughter. The company split about 2 years ago, and I went on to a new company, and she and the awesome dude stayed at the old one. Why, oh why, do some people seem so entitled and full of fake self-worth after they finish college? Graduating from college is not an amazing feat these days. If you go to class, study a little bit, and commit to 4 years or whatever, you're going to graduate. That doesn't make you an expert at all, or better than anyone else. Literally over 4 million people graduate from college every year. You're not special, and you're leaving college with 0 real life experience in your field. Act accordingly, rookies.